Hi and welcome to our April Tea of the Month video, which is all about this month's amazing tea, Moonlight White. April's issue is very special because it's the second in our Classics of Tea series. Last September we translated the Cha Jing, which is the most important tea book in the world from the Tang Dynasty written by Lu Yu. And this month we translated Song Huizong, the emperor himself's treatise on tea. Now the emperor is an amazing, amazing fellow. And imagining him somewhere in the palace whisking tea has always been a vision that brings me great joy. And his treatise on tea is one of my favorite of the classics because it's full of mystery and deep tea wisdom that makes it very challenging to translate. But when you do read a few translations and you can read some of the Chinese, you realize that he was actually very, very profound. Song Huizong was, they say, a very terrible emperor, but a very beautiful man. He's known for the fact that he died in tragedy and he lost the empire to the northern invaders and actually spent the last part of his life across the border in exile and died kind of alone and sad. But on the other hand, he was such a great supporter and facilitator of the arts. He collected artists to him from all over the country. He not only that, but he made a huge compendium of antiquities, of paintings and calligraphy and statues and all the arts that were there in the kingdom at his time. He brought them all together, and that collection and the writings on that collection have been of great service to Chinese art historians from then until now. And he built organizations to facilitate training for artists and support for artists and gave them very high positions in court. So he was very much in support of all the arts, poetry, calligraphy, painting, all of these things. And in the beginning of his reign, everything was very peaceful and flourishing, and there was a real majesty to him. He himself was an amazing calligrapher and painter and poet, and of course a tea person, which is really amazing to read a treatise written in the words of the emperor himself, and not just some casual surface interpretation of tea, but actually quite deep sentiments based on very profound understandings of plant medicine, of Taoism and Taoist lore and mysticism, and also a very profound understanding of tea that very much makes me feel a strong sense of kinship with him. And a strong sense of kinship with this amazing character who not only was emperor of the world, or what was to him the known world, but also lived this extremely poetic life where he was surrounded by so much art and glory, and then it was all taken away from him and he died in this poetic tragedy, which from a distance seems almost gloriously storybook, but of course for him meant a great deal of suffering. His life and his relationship to tea inspires me deeply, and thinking of him brewing tea and sharing tea, especially through the lens of the deep and profound approach and insights that he has in his treatise, is very, very inspiring. Those of you who read the Cha Jing back in September will remember that we included in the introduction a little bit of our perspective on all of the brewing advice that is in these ancient classics and how oftentimes it's not very helpful for us, because in those days they had access to very different tea than we have today. It was grown differently and processed differently, and then they had very different water to brew with. They had a much greater variety. In those days, tea sages separated water into heaven and earth, and their brewing also was very, very different. So the brewing advice in these classics is not very relevant to us today because we have different teaware, different water, and a very different method of brewing. If all there was in these classics was brewing advice, then I think they wouldn't be worth all the tremendous effort that it takes to translate them, because these ancient texts are very difficult to translate. They're difficult to read even for modern Chinese, and very difficult to translate because they are terse and very pithy. So just a few words can be unpacked in 17 directions and become a whole paragraph or even a whole page in English. And if it was just offering us brewing advice that's no longer relevant in our day and age, they really wouldn't be worth translating. But why they are worth translating is because though the tea itself is different and though the brewing methodology is different, the spirit of the plant and the approach to tea and their understanding of tea and when they received it, what they experienced is very much the same as what we experience today. If we treat this practice and this plant medicine with reverence, then we very much connect to the same tea spirit that Lu Yu connected to, that Song Huizong connected to. And through that, we find kinship. And through that, I read their words and find tremendous inspiration, tremendous insight, and tremendous benefit to my own tea brewing practice. The Emperor Song Huizong loved white tea above all else. Now, the white tea that he is talking about is very different than the white tea that we have today. In those days, white tea was all wild, and it was just a few trees. He talks about how it was so rare that even the royal tea farms could only produce just a few cakes for each house. So each house had only just a few trees and could only create just a few cakes. The emperor was appreciating in those white tea trees a lot of the same things that we appreciate in especially old growth pu'er today, because they were living tea and they were wild and old growth and very special and rare. So he definitely felt the energy and the plant medicine in them. And we knew we wanted to choose a very special white tea. Though we can't have white tea like he had, nonetheless, we wanted to choose something special that would honor him. Moonlight White allows us to have a conversation about something that's very important for tea lovers to learn, which is that there's often some misinformation that's promulgated in the tea world that all tea is Camellia sinensis and the differences are only in the processing, which is kind of true, but it's also very misleading. It's misleading, first of all, because in modern times, in the last 10 years or so, we have discovered that there are actually more species than just Camellia sinensis. There are several species of tea in Yunnan. For example, our tea of the month, which is not Camellia sinensis, it's Camellia thalanensis. It's a completely other species, and yet when you drink it, it is still tea. It is still the tea spirit, it is still tea. So it's a complicated issue. Also, and more importantly, the genres of tea are as much varietals as they are processing methods. This is because the processing methods themselves developed over hundreds of years to suit particular local varietal or varietals. So farmers adapted their processing over time to suit the varietal or varietals that was local to them. And they evolved and grew their processing through trial and error, through spiritual communication with the plant spirit, and through insight. So, for all the genres, almost all the genres, except for red tea, the processing of a region was developed to suit the varietal or varietals of that region. Also, when we talk about genres of tea, like green tea or oolong, those are big, very basic generalities. Within oolong, there are many kinds of processing. There's ball oolong and striped oolong. There's the oolong processing of Wui and the oolong processing of Anxi or Taiwan. And they're different in very subtle ways. You can talk about the steps. You can talk about the picking, the withering, right? The kilgreen stage, the rolling, the roasting. And yes, those happen in all of those kinds of oolong. But within each of those basic categories are not how a farmer thinks. They're too basic for him. Just like when you first start brewing Gongfu tea, you might think of it in steps. Shower the pot, steep the tea, shower the pot, pour. But those who have been brewing Gongfu tea for many, many years know that there are infinite subtleties in each of those movements. There are many, many different ways to do each of them. And those really basic generalities start getting more and more and more and more subtle. The same for tea processing, right? What you call rolling, there are actually a lot of subtle variations based on the tea leaves and what they need. So the genres of tea are as much varietals as they are kinds of processing, because the processing methods evolved to suit particular local varietals. and they evolved over time to become that. If you take tea from Wui, even if you take cuttings and you take actual trees and you plant them in Taiwan and process them like rogui, which people are doing, it won't be the same. And that processing was evolved over time to suit those particular varietals and that particular terroir. You could even say that since terroir is the environment of the tea, it is the soil, the climate, the rainfall, the sun, it is also the culture and the processing method. So you could include processing method in terroir if you wanted to, and that would be a more encompassing meaning of the word terroir. This is not true, however, of red tea, which is, of course, the tea that is the most consumed in the West. So you can see how this misinformation got spread, because red tea actually is just a processing method. In other words, you can process every tea like red tea. You can make High Mountain Oolong into red tea. You can make pu'er into red tea. It's dianhong, wonderful. And it often turns out well. So since the most consumed tea in the West is red tea, it's no wonder that a lot of Western tea websites and books promote this idea that the differences in tea are just the processing. It's not entirely true, because you can technically process a tea from India like Dragon Well green tea. It won't be the same. And anyone who knows tea will know that it's not tea from Hangzhou. So Hangzhou Dragon Well is a kind of tree, it's a varietal, and it's also a processing method. So white tea is also as much a varietal as it is a processing method. White tea is a very special varietal of tea that, in essence, began in Fuding, in Fujian. The emperor mentions Fujian as a tea growing region, and it's most likely where he got the very rare and special white tea that he heralds in the Treatise of Tea. That is the most famous birthplace of white tea. And the varietal there has, as a mutation, white buds. They're actually not white, they're silverish white. What it is the buds, when they come out of the tree, are covered in all these little silver white hairs. Some say that the silver white hairs protect the buds from insect bites, so that they were an evolutionary mutation to protect the tea trees from insects. So these little white hairs come out on the buds, and that gives them a silverish white appearance. And they wanted to preserve that. So slowly over time, again, the processing and the varietal go together. They developed a very simple processing method for white tea. It is arguably the simplest processing method of all tea. They just pick it and wither it and then dry it. It's really simple. So almost all varietals of tea also exist in Yunnan, or something similar, because that's the birthplace of tea. So there's a lot more genetic diversity there than in the rest of China. So there's many more different kinds of tea in Yunnan than there is in the rest of China, including teas that are so different they are considered to be other species, like this month's tea, which is Camellia thailandensis. But why this Moonlight White is special is because, like the tea in Fuding, it has mutated to have silver white buds with those same hairs. Red buds and purple buds are a little bit more common in different kinds of tea in different parts of the world than white ones. White ones are a little bit more rare. Reddish purple ones happen often, like Suji Chun here in Taiwan often has red buds, and Tei Liao Han in Wui often has reddish purple buds. So reddish purple buds are a little bit more common. White buds like this with the hairs on them are very unique and very rare. Now, we could have chosen a tea from Fuding, but Fuding tea is small leaf and it's bushes, and it's also often commercially produced, so it's made through cuttings, and the cuttings are planted and you have rows of tea bushes. We wanted something a little bit more rare, a little bit more wild and old growth, which seems closer to the kind of tea that Emperor Song Huizong was celebrating in his treatise on tea when he said that white tea was his favorite tea because it was wild and rare and precious, and there was but few trees, and it wasn't domesticated by people. So we turned to Yunnan to choose this month's tea, Moonlight White, which is a white tea. There is some leaves in it, so this tea is better off even with some leaves in it than just the buds. The buds and the leaves together make a nice blend. It gives it some depth and some breadth and some qi from these trees. This white tea is very unique because actually it's withered a little bit more than white tea is ordinarily withered, which puts it somewhere in between a white tea and a red tea. You may have noticed that if you steep it very light, it's akin to a white tea. And if you let it go a little bit longer or use a little bit higher temperature water, it comes out like a red tea. It's somewhere between a white tea and a red tea. It looks like a red tea, and sometimes some sips have hints and flavors of red tea, while other sips have the delicate fragrance of a white tea. They say that it's called Moonlight White because there was a time when this tea was withered under the full moon at night outdoors. That's maybe a colorful story, it's maybe just a legend, or maybe there was a time when this tea was withered like that. Anyway, no matter where it was withered, indoors or outdoors, it was definitely withered for long enough that it was exposed to the night sky and exposed, of course, to the moon energy, because the whole world is exposed to the moon energy. And Moonlight White is a good name for it because, like the moon, it is both strong and delicate. Moonlight White is one of the most mysterious teas that I've ever brewed. Not only does it change a lot from steeping to steeping, but it responds so much to different brewing methods. It's very, very sensitive to how you brew it. It will change gloriously from the amount of leaf that you put in the pot, to the temperature of water, to the way that you brew it, to how long you steep it. It becomes very different teas. If you pour it off right away, it becomes light and golden and more like a white tea. If you steep it for a long time in hotter water, it responds more like a red tea. You can boil it and it will come out dark and rich and complex. There are so many ways to brew this tea, and each one results in something very, very different in the bowl. So it is such a beautiful expression of what tea can be. May all of you be uplifted and enlightened by this month's amazing Moonlight White in all its mystery and glory, exploring many different bowls and cups of all that it can become. And don't forget to raise a bowl to the spirit of Emperor Song Huizong, one of the first members of this global tea hut.